Video. Let's watch Saudi Arabia's catastrophic everything.
It was made possible by Nebula. Use the link down in the description below to support RealLifeLore directly by signing up, where you can watch 26 additional and exclusive full-length videos in my ongoing Nebula Modern Conflict series, covering recent major wars and crises, including this video's next part covering how ISIS was defeated in Iraq and Syria. Perhaps more than any other country today in the 21st century, Saudi Arabia has the most uncertain future ahead of itself. The country truly has almost countless problems ahead of it that it must overcome in order to survive. And they've only been able to overcome all of these problems so far because of their dominance over a critical resource that everyone in the world has wanted for the past 100 years, but from which the world is currently starting to move away from: oil. The Saudi Arabian state is one that is nearly utterly defined by its control over this black liquidy resource. As recently as 20...
Hold on, I'm gonna... Fuck, the goddamn AC is off again. Alright, we're only gonna do a 20-minute walk this time. Half a mile. 20 minutes. Let's continue.
2018, the petroleum business in the country accounted for a whopping 87% of the government's annual budget, 90% of the country's export earnings, and a massive 42% of the country's entire GDP. This is because Saudi Arabia is known today to control approximately a quarter of all the proven oil reserves in the world. The second largest reserves of all the world's countries, second only to Venezuela. But unlike Venezuela's technically larger oil reserves, which are highly crude, difficult, and expensive to access, Saudi Arabia's only slightly smaller reserves are located under pressure just beneath the Earth's surface, and they are extremely easy and cheap to access, and they're much easier to refine. This is why, for decades, Saudi Arabia was the largest producer of oil in the world, and is currently the world's second largest producer, just barely behind the United States. Alongside Russia, these three countries are collectively referred to as the Big Three of global oil production today, because no single other country comes anywhere close to matching them, and they combined produce approximately 40% of all the oil in the world. But America's population is 332 million, and so most of America's oil production is consumed within the country and not exported abroad, which is why America is only the world's 14th largest oil exporter. Saudi Arabia has just about a tenth of the American population, but produces nearly as much oil as it, meaning that they simply have far more that they can never possibly consume on their own, and so they have far more left over to export to other countries. Saudi Arabia is thus by far the largest exporter of oil in the world. And oil continues to provide roughly a third of all the energy that humanity collectively consumes worldwide. Countries like India, China, Japan, South Africa, and numerous European states all import enormous volumes of their own oil supplies from Saudi Arabia, and are thus all heavily reliant on keeping those flows of oil continuing for now. It is this simple calculus that has given Saudi Arabia enormous geopolitical power and clout over the past century, because they've just got more oil to give others than anybody else. And more than any other country, Saudi Arabia is the one most capable of influencing the global price of oil, either negatively or positively. This is because, besides being by far...
I'm hot, that's why I put my hair up. It's fucking, I don't want the bangs no more. It's too hot. Hot for the bangs, chat.
Far the largest exporter of oil, Saudi Arabia also has by far the largest spare capacity of oil production. And this is what truly gives the Saudi state its unbelievable levels of global power. Spare capacity in the oil business refers to the number of oil wells that a country possesses that are not currently being used, but which can be brought online again in a very short notice to rapidly increase production. Saudi Arabia wields the largest spare capacity of oil production in the world, and they usually keep around 1.5 to 2 million barrels per day of oil production reserved in this spare capacity. By rapidly turning this spare capacity back online, Saudi Arabia can rapidly increase its globally significant oil production and dump those extra supplies onto the world market, thus decreasing global prices of oil. And by doing the reverse, by shutting more wells offline and increasing its available spare capacity, Saudi Arabia can rapidly decrease its globally significant oil production and restrict global oil supplies, thus increasing worldwide oil scarcity and increasing global oil prices. This is why Saudi Arabia is often referred to as the central bank of world oil, and it's how the Saudi state can exert significant leverage over every single country in the world, including the world's most powerful country, the United States. While America only imports a fraction of its oil supply from Saudi Arabia these days, overall oil prices in the United States can still be severely impacted by the whims of the absolute monarchy in Saudi Arabia. After the Russians invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, the Western world immediately passed a series of sanctions against Russia that shut that country's oil supply out of their markets, which obviously reduced the supply of oil in their markets and led to a rise in oil prices. And when oil prices rise, it tends to increase inflation in every other sector of the economy, because nearly every business in the world relies on oil at some point in time in its production process. Which means that when oil prices go up, businesses have to raise their prices in order to offset their increased production costs. So, after the Russians invaded Ukraine and the global price of oil shot up, and inflation rates went up along with it, the Biden administration in the United States requested that Saudi Arabia turn more of their spare capacity on and ramp up production to place more oil onto the global market, in order to decrease oil prices that would help tame global inflation. But the Saudis instead did the complete opposite. They ended up cutting more of their production over and over these past several months, adding more wells to their offline spare capacity and decreasing the supply of global oil in coordination with Russia, which is increasing oil prices around the world, which is enabling the Russians to earn more money on their own oil sales that is being plowed into waging their war in Ukraine, and it is increasing inflationary pressures in gasoline prices in the United States. As of May 2023, the American Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or SPR, the usually massive emergency stockpile of petroleum that the United States keeps stashed away in tanks in Louisiana and Texas to release during an oil supply crisis, has been gradually depleted every single day since the invasion of Ukraine began, to the lowest level seen in 40 years right now since 1983. Doing so has helped tame gasoline prices in the country for now, but with the
this is the tamed gasoline prices.
reserve now heavily depleted, Washington possesses very little other options available to keep gasoline prices from spiraling upwards leading up to the November 2024 presidential election, other than calling Saudi Arabia and requesting them to turn more of their spare capacity back online, which the Saudis will surely only do if they are given certain favors. This is precisely how Saudi Arabia is able to wield its oil might and exert geopolitical influence across the entire world in the process. But Saudi Arabia's great challenge in the 21st century is that this greatest of its powers has a finite lifespan remaining. And at a certain point in the future, a day will come when this power will completely evaporate altogether. Because over the next several decades, as countries
Friendly reminder that Biden admin greenlit more drilling permits than Trump. That's the least friendly reminder, especially considering that like all those drill permits are not even like solving the problem now, because a big chunk of the problem now consists of American oil manufacturers, American oil suppliers reducing the normalized prices. And then on top of that, getting a bunch of new fucking permits for no goddamn reason. Absolutely fucked up.
Countries around the world steadily continue moving their economies away from oil as an energy source, Saudi Arabia's great advantage of being the global
Jews control Hollywood friendly question. BLM equals gay question mark. You all right, dude? Fuck out of here.
oil business's central bank will matter less and less. And if the country does nothing to change itself between now and whenever that uncertain future date arrives, it will only be left with sand, one of the worst human rights records on the planet, an archaic religious absolute monarchy that most of the outside world finds repugnant, and a lack of protection from the United States, while being surrounded by countless enemies from both within and without. If Saudi Arabia does nothing to change, Saudi Arabia will no longer exist at all by the end of the century. But change is also going to be very, very hard and uncertain. And if you want to understand where Saudi Arabia is going in the future, you've got to understand where Saudi Arabia came from in the first place, and why the country would have almost certainly never managed to exist at all in its current form, were it not for the very fortunate discovery of oil very early on into its history. For thousands of years, the Arabian Peninsula was divided between various different tribes, sheiks, kings, and empires. There was very little to note about the lands in the center of the Arabian Peninsula, where the House of Saud first originated in history, a little more than 300 years ago, in a region known as the Najd. The overwhelming majority of Saudi Arabia's current lands are completely uninhabitable.
Now they're trying to get their money into sports like golf and soccer. I don't think they're getting into golf and soccer because they want to make money off of it. I think that's the marketing side of things. They just have that kind of money to be able to fucking dump it. No, what they're trying to do is also diversify in a way that I wonder if they will allow Saudi Arabia to diversify in a way that they would never allow like Venezuela. I also don't really know how the fuck you would diversify your portfolio. I guess they have a lot of money, so they'll probably get into like the stock market. They'll try to become the next England. I don't think that'll happen though. That's what the Neom shit is about. It's just unrealistic. Yeah, no, Neom is not real. That's not happening. Bro, tell me you don't believe this bullshit. Like, yeah, the House of Saud might not exist, but the nation itself will exist. That country is too important to Muslims. Wait, what? I'm not talking about Saudi Arabia ceasing to exist, but Saudi Arabia and the way that it currently operates, it has a lifespan. Sandra's Bubble, thank you for the 100 gifted subs. They already have a huge stock investment fund. I know. Christ. 100 gifties, holy fuck.
The country is, after all, the largest in the world today that doesn't have a single river anywhere to be found within it. Rainfall across most of the country's land is extremely scarce, and so fresh water for drinking and agriculture have historically been extremely difficult to come by. Across the south of the modern country is a vast desert known as the Rub al-Khali, better known in English as the Empty Quarter. It is the largest continuous expanse of sand that can be found anywhere in the world. It is nearly completely devoid of life, and it is larger in area than the entirety of France. The region of Najd, deep within the interior of the Arabian Peninsula, was an extremely sparsely populated and isolated backwater, separated from the rest of the world by vast empty deserts and high mountains with nothing of value to offer anyone in the outside world. It was a place hardly anyone paid any attention to, and its extreme isolation from the rest of the world was partially why an extremely strict interpretation of Sunni Islam.
Wait, did you guys actually see what happened? The Bernie Sanders fell on her. She fucking ran away so fast. It was so funny. She laid next to Bernie and accidentally made him fall over. Yeah. She's underneath me right now. She literally ran so fast her toes skid on the ground like if she was sliding like a goddamn cartoon, sliding in place.
Gradually developed there, now sometimes known as Wahhabism. It was an unlikely place from which one of the most powerful nations of the modern world would arise from, but so it did regardless. Across the 18th and 19th centuries, two small and largely unknown family clans within the Najd region cemented an alliance between themselves. The House of Saud, who would run the politics and day-to-day governance of the lands they controlled, and the clan of Wahhab, who would run the land's religious affairs based upon their own extremely strict interpretation of Sunni Islam, the previously mentioned branch of the faith that is sometimes referred to as Wahhabism. After joining forces, the Saud and Wahhab alliance went on to carve out the first Saudi state that survived between 1744 and 1814, before it was ultimately destroyed by the Ottomans. A group of survivors managed to take back the Saud's ancestral capital at Riyadh in 1818, and from there they carved out the second Saudi state that survived for most of the rest of the 19th century until 1891, when catastrophic infighting among the royal family and conflict with a rival family clan known as the Rashidis led to the state's ultimate collapse. The surviving Saud family members were forced to flee from Riyadh as exiles into nearby Kuwait, where they were powerless without any lands and without any wealth, but with a very good historical claim to the supposedly worthless lands of Najd in the interior of Arabia. There and then, the Saud family probably would have vanished into irrelevance, never to be seen or heard from again, were it not for the ambitions of a young man of the family who would ultimately become known as Ibn Saud. the man who would create the modern-day Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Determined to restore his family's position of power, a 27-year-old Ibn Saud in 1902 led a party of a couple dozen loyal men from Kuwait to recapture his family's ancestral seat in Riyadh from the rival Rashidi clan. It was the beginning of a decades-long campaign of conquest waged across Arabia for the young man. But at first, very few people from the outside world paid any attention to it. The lands that now constitute Saudi Arabia back then in the early 20th century may have only been home to as few as 2 million people, who were almost entirely very poor desert roaming nomads. And so the squabbling between two rival clans in these lands was hardly noticed by any of the great powers of the day. But things began shifting during World War I. The Rashidi clan was allied to the Ottoman Empire, and after the war broke out, the British began supplying weapons and cash to Ibn Saud, who was fighting against them. That, combined with Ibn Saud's own alliance to the ultra-Sunni Wahhabi clan that provided tens of thousands of fanatical and now well-armed troops, proved decisive. By the early 1920s, the Najd region of Arabia had been entirely conquered, but the campaigns weren't quite finished yet. After World War I's conclusion and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, the British appointed the Arab Hashemite family as the new reigning monarchs in 3 newly created kingdoms: Iraq, Jordan, and the Hejaz, which crucially included the 2 holiest cities in Islam, Mecca and Medina. But relations between the British and the Hashemite family quickly soured after the war's conclusion, after the British transformed Jordan and Iraq into colonial mandates and began letting Jews settle in Palestine. The Hashemites ruling the Kingdom of Hejaz refused to ratify the 1919 Treaty of Versailles, and so the British withdrew their support for the family and backed up their other Arab wartime ally, Ibn Saud and his expanding kingdom in the Najd. Emboldened, Ibn Saud launched a new military campaign by invading the Kingdom of Hejaz in 1924, which was fully conquered within only a single year. By 1925, the modern territory of Saudi Arabia was fully under the control of Ibn Saud after more than 20 years worth of nearly constant warfare, including the Holy.
It's funny because we look at this stuff and we go, why the fuck were the British and French involved in anything like this when they're so goddamn far away? But then the same chatters failed to recognize that the top of the hour is also upon us, and there's a 3-minute ad break in a similar capacity where you're like, why the fuck is the top of the hour coming and ruining everything for us? Well, let me tell you, it's because of a contractual obligation, but fear not. We can avoid those ads as long as you subscribe. For $5 or free with a Twitch Prime by connecting your Amazon Prime account to your Twitch account. Psychedelic Gazelle, thank you for the 20 gifted subs, allowing 20 people to no longer see the ads at the top of the hour. Here's a 3-minute ad break now. Because the Ottomans fucked up, they did. Things were a lot better, okay, until the Fire Nation came. That's all I'm going to say. Actually, what I was gonna talk about wasn't the fucking ad break segue, but like people look at the situation. People look at this situation in England and France, and they're like, why the fuck were they meddling in these affairs so much? What's happening here? But then fail to recognize that America is doing the exact same thing right now.
Cities of Mecca and Medina. A few years later on, in 1932, Ibn Saud proclaimed the creation of a brand new kingdom over all of these lands, and he named it after himself and his family, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, with himself, naturally, as the new kingdom's absolute monarch. The third Saudi state had been born, covering a large amount of the lands that the previous 2 Saudi states from the 19th and 18th centuries had also encompassed. The very basis of Ibn Saud's argument and later the Saudi state's argument right up into the 2020s today, that he was merely restoring his own family's historical territorial claims. But his new kingdom entered into life in 1932 as a severely troubled one. The kingdom had been created through decades worth of violent warfare and conquest, and many of the lands Ibn Saud now controlled were forcefully conquered, and included many people who found his alliance with the extremely orthodox Wahhabists as off-putting. Shia Muslim minority populations were found in the eastern province near the Red Sea, and in the south near Yemen, who often felt religiously persecuted by the Sunni fundamentalist, Wahhabi-aligned regime. And even less strict fellow Sunni Muslims in the now conquered Kingdom of Hejaz felt on edge. Moreover, the exiled and furious Hashemite family continue to rule kingdoms in neighboring Jordan and Iraq, with very good claims to the Hejaz region. Internal instability within the new kingdom was rife, and to try and preserve the peace, Ibn Saud married a daughter of every one of the other tribes he had conquered. 20 wives in all, who would go on to produce more than 100 children for him, including 45 sons, 6 of whom would go on to later rule the kingdom after his death, including the current 87-year-old king today in 2023, who was born when Ibn Saud was 60. And after decades of warfare, the new kingdom's finances were in a pretty terrible state. With nothing but a tiny tax base of 2 million impoverished people, the only actually important
Bro, turn off the camera, go down to the bar, buy a girl a drink, get a girlfriend, start a family, quit streaming. Learn to respect your elders is lost. I'm here to replace your fears with guidance. Shut the fuck up, bitch.
Important thing that Ibn Saud's new kingdom controlled to earn money from was its control over the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, which only brought in modest amounts of religious tourism to the state's struggling coffers. At this point in time, it was far more likely that either Egypt or Iraq, with their plentiful agricultural farmland around the Nile and Tigris-Euphrates rivers, would emerge as the dominant source of the Arab world's geopolitical power in the 20th century, just as they had both been for literally all of human history beforehand. But of course, the discovery of oil suddenly changed everything. You see, oil had been discovered previously in commercial quantities in nearby Iran, Iraq, and Bahrain, and Ibn Saud had convinced himself that there was still oil to be discovered within his kingdom nearby as well. But it was the British who had discovered oil in Iran, Iraq, and Bahrain, and Ibn Saud didn't exactly trust the imperialist and colonial tendencies of them. So, instead, Ibn Saud went to the Americans to get them searching for oil in his kingdom. In 1933, the year
Good thing they would never do such a thing.
after his kingdom was proclaimed, Standard Oil Company of California, or SoCal, later known as Chevron, was granted the exclusive contract to begin the search. It was only 5 years later, in 1938, when they made the first discovery of oil in Saudi Arabia at a well known as Dammam No. 7, right by the Persian Gulf. Initially, SoCal created a wholly owned subsidiary assigned to the oil they discovered in Saudi Arabia that would eventually be named Arabian American Oil Company, aka Aramco. After Saudi Arabia managed to take full control over the subsidiary company itself later on, it became simply known as Saudi Aramco, the modern state-owned Saudi oil giant. From 1938 onwards, more and more oil fields were steadily discovered across Saudi Arabia's sparsely populated eastern province, and production steadily increased up to the point where the country was the 22nd largest producer of oil in the world, significant enough to begin attracting the attention of the American government during World War II. Oil was becoming more important than ever before during that war, and the American president at the time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, knew that America and the post-war Washington-led alliance structure needed as much oil as they could possibly get to compete with the Soviet bloc in the war's aftermath. Ibn Saud was a man who still had many enemies, with the British-backed Hashemites still in power in Iraq and Jordan, and many Saudis within the country who didn't like his and the Wahhabists' absolute rule. And so it eventually became time for him and FDR to finally meet. They did so upon a ship in the Suez Canal in February of 1945, mere weeks before FDR's own death, and their agreement became the basis for the Saudi-American relationship that has largely endured ever since. The United States, despite being a secular constitutional republic, would back the ultra-Islamic.
That's so shocking to me. They would never do. Wait, what? What? That's not a thing that ever happens, man. That's so strange.
Absolute monarchy of Saudi Arabia, because both had something the other desperately wanted. America wanted access to the increasingly important Saudi oil fields, both for itself and for its allies all around the world.
Like, what were we doing at the time to, like, I don't know, black people, for example? You know what I mean? It's not like America was a beacon of prosperity, a shining beacon of freedom, you know.
While the Saudis wanted America's security, because as a sparsely populated country with nothing of value whatsoever besides for oil, they knew they could never hope to defend themselves or their oil on their own. either against their own people or their external rivals. But who would ever dare to attack them if they had the backing of the most powerful country in the world? Over time, this basic arrangement between
Okay, once again, I mean, hold up. At that time, were we objectively the most powerful nation on the planet? Like, I mean, I feel like we're doing a lot of militarily, yes. No, this isn't. Let me see. No, this is not. I think this was immediately after World War II. I thought this was before.
Between the most external to defend them, seeing a value in America's both other Islamics to 45 to final the Wahhabists' absolute rule.
Oh, it's 1945. Okay.
And so it eventually became time for him and FDR to finally meet. They did so upon a ship in the Suez Canal in February of 1940. Desperately wanted. America wanted access to the increasingly important Saudi oil fields, both for itself and for its allies all around the world, while the Saudis wanted America's security, because as a sparsely populated country with nothing of value whatsoever besides for oil, they knew they could never hope to defend themselves or their oil on their own, either against their own people or their external rivals. But who would ever dare to attack them if they had the backing of the most powerful country in the world? Over time, this basic arrangement between America and Saudi Arabia, security guarantees in exchange for oil, has continually evolved but remained more or less